when I joined the company, I felt like robbed. And what I mean by this is I felt like I entered a spaceship that had like technology from like 1,000 years in the future, and nobody like knew about it.
Welcome to Partner Path, a podcast that unpacks the venture capital and growth equity ecosystem from a junior perspective. Young entrepreneurs and investors have already had a massive impact on the industry, having started unicorns and launched billion-dollar funds. We discuss these success stories and more by sharing perspectives and advice from some of the industry's most prominent role models. This podcast expresses our views as of the date published and does not represent the views of and is not endorsed by any company for which we work. Before we get to the episode, Laura and I are excited to announce a partnership with Overlap. Fresh out of Y Combinator's summer batch, Overlap is an AI-driven app that uses large language models to curate the best moments from podcast episodes. Imagine having a smart assistant who reads through every podcast transcript, finds the best parts or parts most relevant to your search, and strings them together to form a new, curated stream of content. That is what Overlap does. I personally use Overlap to explore content on future podcast guests and highly recommend it as another diligence tool for investors. Check out Overlap on the App Store today.
Today we're joined by Chris Chedeau, an engineer at Meta. Chris is originally from France and is the co-creator of React Native and Excalidraw. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
We're excited to have you. You have another name, which is called Vjeux, which is your alter ego, one could say. Maybe let's just open up with why are folks calling you Vjeux and what exactly does that mean?
Yeah, that makes sense. So when I was 12 years old, I wanted to play Counter-Strike, like a video game with my friends. And so I was in France, and the way you say video game in French is jeu vidéo. And so what I ended up doing is like swapping jeu and video. So video, jeu, and then I removed the ideo. And so it's spelled Vjeux. And so in practice, this is 5-letter like words that have never been taken anywhere online. And so it's like very unique and it's very nice. Unfortunately, I moved to the US and nobody knows how to pronounce it. And same for my last name. So at least it makes a good intro starter.
And was this around the same age that you started coding?
Yes.
Okay, and what age was that?
So I was around 12, 11, 13, so.
We learned that you really started coding by learning how video games work,
Yes.
World of Warcraft, building custom apps. What clicked for you at that age and how did you get into it? Because you were growing up in France, I believe.
Yeah, so I was in Paris and I was like a huge gamer and especially on the Blizzard games. And so at that point I was playing Warcraft 3. Which is a real-time strategy game where you've got a mini army of monsters and you need to battle against other monsters. And one of the interesting things is they had a map editor. And so in the map editor, you could start creating your own custom maps. And one of the things that they did, which was super fascinating to me, is they had a trigger editor where you were able to say, hey, when the units enter this area, then make it move to this other area. And there was a lot of scripting like this, but it didn't feel like scripting. You were just clicking hey, if this, then this, then this, then this. And one thing I've learned is that, I've learned all of the programming concepts like variables and action and condition and these kind of things, but through building this. And at some point, one of the very fascinating things is in practice, they outputted an actual programming language. And there was a way to open the editor and find a special option to see what programming language it actually outputted. And then at some point I was started writing directly in this programming language. And so this was my first foray into the concept of programming. And I'm really glad because a lot of people are playing games and this is a very good and intuitive way to start learning how to code.
Definitely. Then you took kind of what you learned in that use case and moved it to some very interesting, deeply technical use cases and contributed it to some open source projects. What took you to the next level? Yeah. And I believe something that sparked it was moving from France to the US when you were interviewing.
So I was working on Warcraft 3 and then Blizzard released a new game which is called World of Warcraft. And this time you couldn't do maps, but you could change the user interface of the game. And so I was starting playing around with this. And during the beta, there's a group of people that created a modification of the UI of the game called Cosmos UI. And there was a collective of 20 people contributing a lot of different extensions. And one of the things, it was so needed because the base UI of the game was like not good enough, that at some point, like almost everybody in the World of Warcraft community was using it. And to such an extent, when there was a new patch, like the Blizzard released a new patch, it was called Patch Day No Play, because our extension was relying on the internal of the game and was actually breaking during patch. So we were like scrambling to figure out, hey, how to update whatever has changed. And so for like a few hours, like to a day, we had to like wait. People had to wait until we actually fixed it. And so this was like a very, like my first like real kind of project I was involved into. And at that point, I ended up getting my first contract with the people working on this. And so I was 13 at the time. And so my parents received like a stack of documents around like, hey, you're
That's
going
amazing.
to be employed and you're underage, so like a bunch of like conditions from a US company. So that was my like first time I actually made any money doing coding for video games.
It's so interesting. We meet so many folks who get started programming because of video games or things they learned on the internet or getting involved in the open source world when they're very young. And oftentimes those people become sort of the most technical, down to the details folks in Silicon Valley. I'm curious, do you think we're now in this vibe coding era? Do you think that's going to push more people to paths like the path that you went down? Or is the dynamic just different than it used to be?
One of the things that was very interesting, like when I started learning how to program, is in practice, like being a programmer, at least in France, was like being like the bad version of a geek.
Yeah.
And like nobody cared and like everybody thought you were a loser and those kind of things. And so like there was not this aura that like right now we have, which is very different. And so I've learned basically because I enjoyed doing this and I wanted to do it like against basically everybody else. But now one of the things is in this day and age, being a software engineer is the top of the game that you can do everywhere. And so now it attracts a lot of people that are not really interested in this. But this is like, hey, like you were a lawyer, or like you were a doctor, like 100 years ago. Now this is what you do to be successful. And so it attracts a very different kind of crowd. And so I think for the new kind of crowd, like, yep, like they're doing a good job and everything, but I don't think they have like the passion. If they were like doing anything in their free time and everything, that would be doing this. So I think there's two different classes of like people.
Do you think that's true in the open source community as well? We've obviously seen the commercialization of open source, and open source is not just something that people do for the love of the game anymore.
Yeah.
As someone who's contributed so much to open source, do you feel there's a difference in the motivations of the people building these products?
The interesting thing about open source is I've been maintaining a bunch of different open source projects over the years. And you can really tell like very easily, like when somebody sends a pull request, whether they actually do it because they actually want to solve a real problem that they have, or because they want to do it for the status or the prestige or those kind of things. And so one thing I've learned is to spend a lot of time for people that are like really truly motivated, and then now rise them up and like get them to be core contributor and those kind of things. And that's been like very successful. So I think this is like everything in life. There's people with different kind of motivations, and you need to figure out how to extract like the best way possible and like get them hyped and motivated. So.
And then from your open source experience at Meta, you're almost working as an entrepreneur within a massive company. So what has it been from your experience as, you know, basically a founder, like through Excalidraw, through Prettier, and building it within Meta versus spinning out and, to Dan's point, commercializing some of these projects that developers are obsessed with?
The first one is when we open sourced React. So I was like very deeply involved. And one of the things I've always had this in the back of my mind is, what is the way to make this a viable commercial project? And that's been like very interesting is in practice itself, React, like it's not going to be successful if we make people pay for it. Mm-hmm. And now there's a lot of other ways you can like actually generate revenue from React. But in practice, like we built React to solve like Facebook's problems. And we had problems like everybody else in the industry, and like, oh, there was a unique way to do it. And it actually solved the problems for Facebook. And so now we open sourced it, and like it solved problems for a lot of other people. But the intention of React was like, hey, we want to solve problems for Facebook first. And it actually did. And so the business model for this is now Facebook is paying us money to solve Facebook's problem. And that happens to be useful for everybody else, so might as well open source it. And the good thing with open source, there's a lot of like downstream positive effects. So for example, a big challenge if you're like working on a proprietary code base, if you're hiring people, they don't know the stack you're using. And so like there is going to be a lot slower. And so now if everybody's using React and like they join like Facebook, then like, oh, everybody like from day one can like start being productive. And then the second one is like there's the notion of like being a thought leader. If as we like open source React and I organized the first React.js conf, which was like insane, literally the people were begging the CTO of Facebook to be able to get tickets because like everybody wanted in. And so this is the kind of thing where like now like it makes people want to join the company that is building those open source projects. So there's a lot of ways the company actually benefits. Now one of the things is a lot of people think about open source as like, hey, what is my open source strategy to like attract like talents? But I think we need to reflect it differently. It's like, hey, what are the like actually really good infrastructure projects we're working within the company that's actually better than everything else in the world that we can open source? And I think thinking about this is going to like be more effective than like trying to figure, okay, what is the next open source project I need to build to like attract like a bunch of customers? Yeah. And if it's not actually solving the core business, your core business, then it's always going to be like a side thing and not going to be like very likely to be successful.
Now, a quick word from our sponsor. Laura and I are thrilled to announce a partnership with Grata, an intuitive deal sourcing and diligence platform. Keep missing out on private market deals? Ditch the Rolodex and get Grata. Grata's AI-powered platform provides accurate data, deep insights, and time-saving workflows that help get more deals done. And it's trusted by over 500 firms and 3,000 deal makers, including myself. I've personally used Grata in both my deal sourcing and diligence workflows and would recommend their tool to any investor across private equity, growth equity, corp dev, or investment banking. We've negotiated a special offer for our audience. Mention PartnerPath to the Grata team during sign-up, and you'll get free executive seats for your partners and MDs included in your subscription. Now, back to the episode.
There are a few really interesting threads to pull there. Maybe to start, I'd love to get your version of the story of when you were at Meta and you guys decided to build React and ultimately open source and sort of evangelize it. What were the triggers? What was the problem that you were trying to solve? And perhaps why did you decide this is what I'm going to devote my time to work on within the broader context of this very big, very fast growing company?
That makes sense. So I wasn't at the very, very beginning, but I was like a few months before we did the open source, but I can tell you like my thinking. So the first thing is, as I mentioned, I was like super into like video games and then web development, but as a random child, like or adolescent in Paris, and all I've read was like on the internet. And at some point I got the offer like for Facebook and I moved halfway across the world, married my girlfriend and everything. And one of the things that was very interesting at the time is when I joined the company, I felt like robbed. And what I mean by this is I felt like I entered a spaceship that had like technology from like 1,000 years in the future and nobody like knew about it. And we actually didn't like do, I think, a good enough job like evangelizing. And so I made it my mission in life to make sure that like everybody knows that like a brighter technology actually exists that's all for them. And the interesting thing was actually not in the context of JavaScript or React. It was in the context of our own version of PHP. And so I've been building a PHP for a long time and everybody was mocking PHP. Oh, it's not a real programming language like the same way they've been for JavaScript. Mm-hmm. But the PHP version within Facebook had like classes, arrow functions, like a bunch of things or like types, type checking, a lot of things that was like alien to like the whole community. And I really wanted to help with open source. The issue is that we've tried with open source HVM or like PHP VM hack and those kind of things, but it never like really took off. But the thing is, with React, we basically took all of the ideas that's really good in the PHP world within like Meta, and we were able to like basically translate them to JavaScript. And we were able to like push all of this at once to the broader community. For me, like this was the best time because I could like share all of the cool stuff we were doing to the rest of the world, not just for like React itself, but like the entire builder ecosystem.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I think we see this so often with companies where effectively what they're doing is taking the best practices of some of the best tech companies in the world and packaging it in open source or infrastructure that makes it consumable for your average developer somewhere. And eventually that just kind of moves the quality bar for everybody up over time. The other thing that's very interesting to me, there's a lot that's been written about the framework wars of the 2010s and the rise of React. I'm curious, you were in the rooms where these decisions were being made. Was there sort of a conscious effort of, we're going to win the war, we're going to win the market, we're going to make this the standard? Because ultimately, you guys were solving your own problems and evangelizing it, but you weren't in a market share war from a revenue perspective.
Yeah. The interesting thing is like a lot of people think that there was a war between the people like doing the frameworks and everything. But in practice, all of us were trying to solve the same problem, and we're actually like friends, and we had meetings together, like trying to figure out, hey, how did you actually solve it? And so there was not like a war in that sense, actually like working very closely with each other. And now this is like the Twitter effect where like, oh, everybody wants like some drama and this kind of thing. So everybody like pitted against each other. And one of the first thing I've done when I started working on React is anytime I was very active on IRC and like building a community, and every time somebody thrashed like some other framework or whatever, I would say like, nope, we're not doing this here.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you can have your opinion and everything, but like let's look at the fact and this kind of thing. And Angular is also really good, and Knockout.js is good, and like whatever like framework of the day. And let's figure out, okay, what are the challenges that you're facing with those technologies, and is there a way React can help with this? So this has been like the mindset I've really like put in very early on in the community. And so I've tried to implement this in a way that like, yeah, people like feel welcomed and doesn't derail. Now, I'm not going to be lying. Like, we actually wanted React to be like the best thing ever.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's very interesting to me with like the Silicon Valley and tech in general is a lot of people think about like being the best in Wall Street's like kind of zero-sum game type of games, where like if you are like winning, this means that somebody else is losing. And the interesting thing with tech is, no, actually you can be winning and everybody else around you can be winning. And this is like a mindset we are using within like Meta's calibration system. Like, how do we reward people? Is usually we want collaboration. And so it's actually better to have like a successful project and to reward everybody that actually participated in like very successful projects, compared to, oh, one person actually succeeded, so like everybody else, even though they participated, don't get any credits.
Mm-hmm.
So this is like, I think like one of the strengths of like the whole Silicon Valley ecosystem is like you don't need others to lose to actually win.
Yeah, and I think also as it relates to technology and JavaScript, probably the biggest lever in making React bigger is making the JavaScript world bigger. And all the other frameworks doing well ultimately evangelizes JavaScript, and as a result, some of that benefit is going to accrue back to React and that community.
Yeah. And the thing I'm mentioning with React is not just React. So in practice, it's been like, oh, ESLint, Webpack, and all of the packagers, TypeScript and Flow for the like the type system, Prettier for like pretty printing, and like all of this actually make the entire like space better. So I agree with you that like this is not one just like small thing. It's like everybody boat rises, like the tide rises all of the boats kind of effects.
Was there anything that surprised you about the way the React ecosystem has evolved as it's becoming the go-to way to build applications?
I think the biggest thing that shocked me is, we started with React, and I was like, okay, so like we built like a bunch of people, like I've been like became like core members of the React community and everything. And then at some point, like we like the same teams started working on React Native, and then we open source React Native. And my expectation was that the people that were pillars of the React community would actually become the pillars of the React Native community. But in practice, it didn't happen. And the thing that's been like very fascinating to me is like in practice, a whole new set of people started becoming like the go-to like React Native kind of folks. And when I reflected back on this, I was like, oh, it actually makes sense. Usually, in order for you to contribute to like an open source project, you need to be at a right point in time in your career where like, hey, you have like a lot of free time and like you have problems that you're trying to solve. And then like this is like the right time between like your personal career and the technology that solves your problems. And then you can rise with it. But then like once you're established in this particular space, you have a lot less interest to actually go and like start on a brand new, like very risky bet, even though it's in the same space. And so we end up rebuilding like a new set of people every time. And so then like Excalidraw came and Prettier came, and again, like there was some familiar faces, but a lot of time like you're building up new people as you go.
Yeah. Well, I think the common thread in those is is you and your leadership. So I'm curious, like, what, after doing React and then going to React Native, what has motivated you to continue putting out these projects that are obviously a lot of time and effort for you?
The first thing is, a lot of people ask me like, hey, are you going to retire? And I'm like, no, like I'm 35. I'm like actually super excited. And this is the thing is like, even if I were not employed right now, I would still work on this kind of stuff.
Yep.
So I'm like genuinely like excited and motivated. And the good thing is I've been reflecting a lot over the years around like, hey, what is my superpower? And so my manager at some point did an exercise of like, what is your superpower and what is your kryptonite? And I found that my superpower is, if you think about all the projects in tech, the successful one, they follow a S-curve. Where like at the beginning, this is very flat and like this is more like the R&D kind of thing. And then now find like the sweet spot of R&D and product market fit. And now like it starts going to exponential. And then at some point, like the exponential ends and now it starts like going flat again. And my sweet spot is at the very beginning of the S-curve. And to try to find like what are the people that have found like a really interesting R&D thing that is now like ready to be productionized. And then start working with them and molding it, shaping it into a product that's going to be successful. And now once it's like starts going and being successful, I'm like, okay, my work is done. So I still need to be somewhat involved to get the credit and everything, but now I'm going to let it take off and like create a team around this, all those kind of things. And now figure out like what is the next like inflection point I can start. And I wouldn't be honest, but I always think about like, hey, I've done all of those amazing things. Like, okay, how can I do like something bigger, better and everything? And every time like it happened that I'm like doing one. So I don't have a secret, but this happens. So yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think one amazing thing reflecting back on React is just, it feels like the S curve is still going in terms of the exponential growth and how many people it touches.
Yeah.
And we were chatting a bit about this before we started. It feels like for a long time, the JavaScript community was just for front-end engineers, and then it became for all engineers. And I think what we're seeing now is that the rise of AI and code gen is giving a boost to tools and technologies that, for one reason or another, the AI likes to use. And it feels like JavaScript and React is at the top of that list. I'm curious, when you reflect back, the level of abstraction of React seems to have been perfect for a very, very long period of time. Were there crucible decisions that you guys made when you were developing it that you think have paid off over the long run?
Jordan Walk is the one to get credit for this. And I was more like the hype man and like getting things. But there was a few things. One is like the actual model of programming. And so one of the things is going to be a bit technical, but one of the things which was super fascinating is the first time I actually met Jordan Walk, it was like 3 months after I joined the company. And I was like into front end and somebody told me like, hey, you should talk to this Jordan guy. He's working on like some new front end framework thing. Like you may be interested. And so I ended up like having a meeting with Jordan, and Jordan asked me like point blank, like a very simple question. What is the hardest thing in front end right now? And I was like, okay, I didn't expect to like get some philosophical question out of this meeting, but I started thinking, I'm like, I don't really know. And what he told me is updates. And his reasoning is the first time you render a page, what you're doing is you fetch all of the data and you concatenate it, like strings to get HTML, and then you send it to the client. And this is very easy. You're just like taking the data, like sending it. But now the update is when it comes to, now you click on buttons. And then like you need to remember like, hey, how did you actually like generate this button? And like what if you change this button, like what are actually going to impact? And like there's this whole web of dependencies that is really hard to manipulate. And the interesting thing is a lot of the bugs we've had and a lot of the difficulty and the challenges were in this updates phase of the world. But if you go back to how we were doing PHP development, is you take all of the data, you send something to the clients, and then when you click on the button, you just redo this entire loop again. And his philosophy was like, hey, why can't we do it the same exact thing on the clients? And in practice, the thing that really clicked for me was, at first I was like, yeah, I think this would solve the problem, but it's going to be like super, super, super slow. And like 2 weeks later, I ended up being bored. And before that, I was working on a way to find guilds for your like video game. And I spent like so many months like hand optimizing, like how do you filter through like thousands of things with like bunch of different filters, and I ended up getting something working super fast. And I was like, okay, let's try this React thingy. And I ended up doing it, and this was insane. Like I spent like half an hour like building it, and it was like not as fast of my hand written thing, but in the same order of magnitude. And then I was like, oh yeah, like we're onto something here.
Yeah.
And the reason why this is working is the space of the problem is that when you're showing a UI, you're limited by the screen size. And so in practice, you're limited by how many things you can show to the user. And in practice, it's going to be like probably like 100 different things. But the computers are like way fast enough to show 100 things and like to recompute 100 things on every single like mouse move, mouse interaction. And so this is like why this actual problem has been like solved in my book, is because now we have a different paradigm that actually works for any kind of UI we can render for the humans to see. And so I think this is like, and this is why I've like left a bit the React world, is because to me it's a solved problem. Sure, we can like have like the next version of React or like a different variance of React, but the programming model has not changed. And now we're no longer in a place where a lot of people are struggling building the existing things. Now people were actually looking for like what is the next framework that's going to solve my problems, but now like people are not really. So
are there any new pockets of innovation or things that have like sparked your interest recently?
I think AI opens up like a whole new world of possibilities. And you mentioned around like how people are going to start like their coding journey. And I think that if I were a kid right now.
Well, you have 2 kids.
Yeah,
that
I
are
have
at
2
the
kids.
age where they are probably coding.
Yep. So they're coding right now. Like we are like pair coding where they tell me what they want on the screen, and I'm like actually doing the work behind the scenes. But the AI is like so nice for this. Well, you don't have to know everything I had to learn. And you can just say, hey, like cursor, like please build like something. And then like, oh, please change this, please change this. And then this is like how you actually get to learn how to program. So I'm really excited about this whole AI world.
If we were to ask you the same question now that Jordan asked you, I guess a decade or so ago, what would the answer be?
Frontend right now is like in a really, really good shape. Now you can actually build like really quickly. And with AI, you can actually bootstrap a lot. And for all of the hosting and CI and everything is like basically solved with Vercel. And so the biggest thing for me is more like the database layer. So there's been like Firebase and Supabase and those kind of things, but to me, it's still not a really, really like good experience. So one thing I want is like basically like how do we abstract away the entire database? And so that like, oh, now like on every single commit, you can maybe have like a different version of your database, and also the real-time aspects. And so right now, a lot of the like real-time database are hacks where they're just listening to everything happening and sending you the whole thing. But for example, there's people at Skip Lang that are working on like a fully reactive database where like, hey, every time you do something, it's going to recompute the minimum amounts of changes that are needed and send them to all of the clients, like the same way React is doing it. So I think the database world is the one was going to be like the most amount of groundbreaking changes. And we're seeing this. We have like a new set of databases coming up every month or every year. So I don't think we'll like find a real sweet spot there.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. It's an area we've spent a lot of time in. We have the Series A in Neon that was recently acquired. And I think that it's been interesting to see for a long time the database world was such a different world and a different type of persona and a different type of user. But as front end has become full stack engineering, you see the users combine. And I think increasingly you see companies like Neon and others try to take the best practices of front end development and apply them to the way databases feel to the developer. And so I'd be very curious to see in the coming 5 or 10 years what the database evolution starts to look like.
So let's move on to Excalidraw and what that looks like inside of Meta today. I was at a dinner with you recently. I think the whole table, potentially the whole room was using it. How did it go from literally a whiteboard to what it is today?
The origin story is very interesting. So it was January 1st, 2020. And I was working at Facebook. I'm still working, but we have to do every 6 months a cycle where you have to do like all of the peer feedback writing, your manager, your self-review. And this is something that is like triggering my procrastination like crazy. And one thing I've decided to do this year is to do something I call active procrastination. So I know I'm not going to be able to write the feedback until the very last minute. So at least let's figure something out that I can actually be productive with. And so I had this idea of writing a blog post for a long time. And so I decided, okay, let's use Zwibbler, which is a whiteboarding tool to draw handwritten diagrams that I used. And I used a demo website, but unfortunately, the demo website was, and I was like, come on, I cannot even do what I wanted to do. And so I decided to go one level deeper. And how hard will it actually be to re-implement Zwibbler? And so I ended up opening Code Sandbox and start hacking on this with Vjeux, and I posted something on Twitter and it exploded. 200 people liked it. And I was like, oh, wow, actually people are really interested in these kind of things. And so I ended up the next day opening a GitHub repo. And one thing I've been doing is creating 25 issues around all of the things that should happen there. And so I basically try to not snipe people from actually contributing. And one thing to get them hooked is whenever somebody actually submitted a pull request and I merged it, what I would do is actually give them commit access and be owner of the repo. And so I know very few people are doing this, and people are afraid that hey, what could they do nefariously and everything. But for me, it's hey, it costs me nothing. This product doesn't exist. And now they actually are going to be a lot more motivated to actually make it into something. And so I ended up going there and iterating. So I want to say I did write my feedback. So I'm a responsible person. And
a good manager.
Yeah. And 3 months later, what happened is COVID hit and everybody was sent home. And so I ended up receiving a lot of pings from people. Hey, you should actually quit Facebook and start working on this Excalidraw thing full time because everybody needs the virtual whiteboards. And at this point, I was nope, I don't want to quit Facebook. I'm very happy. But I do think that having a company to actually build a SaaS product around Excalidraw makes sense. And so I reached out to all of the top contributors of the project. And the actual top contributor was working on the startup, but the startup wasn't going super well. And I was like, hey, do you want to pivot and start working on this? And he said yes. And so David, with his co-founder, ended up building a company around Excalidraw. And it's been very successful. Now there's 10 people working full time. And so if you want to use Excalidraw within your company, now we have a SaaS offering. We just got SOC 2 compliance. So There's no excuse anymore.
That's awesome. I think the lesson is if you have downtime on your product, Chris is going to come and build an open source competitor.
How do you see the market evolving here? I mean, we've seen in our world other startups pop up as well that probably don't have the quite open source traction that Excalidraw has. But what does the future look like?
I think the future is there's going to be some kind of whiteboards experience on every single software stack ever. And so we are talking about AI. So Firebase Studio just integrated Excalidraw. So what you can do is ask, hey, please build some whatever app. And then they have a little scribble where they can show your screen, the actual app that is built, and then lets you say hey, put an arrow there and say hey, please make this button red or those kind of things. And now it's taking a screenshot, sending it to the machine learning model, and then do all of the things that you want it. So I think there's a lot of very deep integration that should happen everywhere. And I'm seeing at the AI Engineer Conference, half of the slides of the talks I've attended to use Excalidraw. But right now, there's no Excalidraw integration with PowerPoint, Google Slides. And so I think the world I see is that we are going to see the integration of whiteboarding experience to every single app, and it's going to be commonplace. So,
yep. That makes sense. What advice would you give? We have a lot of the audience, to give you some background. We have a lot of founders that listen, or folks who are thinking about leaving their company and going to start something. What advice would you give younger founders who are thinking about building a dev tool company or something with an AI infrastructure? Are there any areas that you would avoid?
So the biggest advice I would give everybody is don't quit your company until you have a working product and people are using it. And the thing which is very interesting in this day and age is the cost of building this kind of companies is actually almost zero. And you can create a prototype and get traction while doing this on the nights and weekends. And so there's no reason to put you in a situation where you're going to be forced to make it successful compared to hey, now you can just do it on the side. And at some point, as it becomes more successful and it's going to work out, now you can actually quit your day job to actually do it full time. And now you don't you're going to have a lot lower stress level because it's working. And sure, you won't have as much time, but in practice, I haven't found that time is the critical factor in this. It's mostly around what is the right idea, what is the right problem you want to solve. So this is my biggest advice I gave everybody. They're listening to me like, no, but this is what I would say everybody.
Just gonna ask, and maybe before we go to a quick fire round, you obviously in not that much time have built many, many very interesting projects. What's on the horizon for you?
The way I'm always thinking about it is I'm trying to figure out like what is bothering me, what is annoying me. And I have a long list of things that are bothering me. But the thing is, what you need to figure out is something needs to bother you like crazy, but there also needs to be an actual solution for this. And the thing is, I cannot predict what are the good solutions are going to, when they're going to come up and everything. And so the way I'm managing my time is I basically talk to a lot of people, try to figure out like, hey, what is everybody thinking about? And like very similar to like what you're doing like in the VC world. And then at some point when I hear someone saying like, oh, I have this particular like solution, and I'm like, oh, I have this particular problem and it would be a match made in heaven. Now I work my schedule to basically drop everything and then start like focusing on it like hardcore for like 6 months, a year to really make it take off. And so this is the kind of thing is it's very unique in the way I approach this, like within the company. Like most people are just doing whatever team they're on and like doing those kind of things. But I have this more like an entrepreneurial mindset for this. And it's also like finding a really good manager for actually making this happen. So I'm really happy with Tom Valin right now as my manager, who's like letting me do this kind of like side quests that I call them. So now in terms of like the specific ones within the company, we have to display profiling information in many shapes or forms. And the issue right now in the ecosystem, there's not a really good profile like trace viewer. And so the best one we have is the Chrome trace viewer that people have hacked to render many other things, but it has a lot of limitations. And so we have an internal project that is spending a lot of time, a lot of like front engineering to make it super fast so you can display. I think the maximum we had is like a 200 gigabytes stack trace, and you can just infinitely zoom on it and pan like CFPS on the client. So this is like the kind of thing like right now is waking me up at night. But again, this is something within the company. And maybe one day it'll be open source, but it's less useful for the audience.
Okay, we'll stay tuned. Should we end with a quick fire round?
Sure.
If you left Meta tomorrow, what startup would you join?
Probably Vercel.
That's what we like to hear.
Good choice. An activity you do outside of work.
So my girls, 9 and 11, and they're super into biking. And so every evening we spend like an hour and a half to go from my house to Stanford and back. So it's like super interesting and get some exercise.
Very fun.
That's amazing.
What's the hardest thing you've done in your career?
Letting go of specific projects. So as you can tell, I'm very attached to my babies, and I had to learn how to go to do something else and like see it prosper without me.
Yeah, kids 3 through 6. Your favorite open source developer tool that you haven't contributed to?
I would say like VS Code.
Awesome. Well, this was fun. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it was super fun.
Thank you, Chris.